We measure everything now. Tablespoons, grams, a phone telling us when to stir. Our grandmothers never measured a single thing, and they fed entire families through the hardest decades this country ever saw. Number 8 kept whole neighborhoods from going hungry, and why it vanished has nothing to do with taste. Number 17 once had its own name on every block across the Midwest. And number 3 was the last thing millions of families made when everything ran out. Hit subscribe. Let's count down 25 forgotten meals our grandmothers made without ever measuring a thing. Number 25, bread and drippings. Every drop of fat from every pan went into a jar behind the stove. When the pantry ran low, that jar came forward. Thick bread, a spread of cold drippings, nothing more. Families across Appalachia and the industrial Midwest ate this at the table without apology. It was supper. The jar was never empty for long. Number 24, potato and onion soup. 2 ingredients, nothing else. Potatoes sliced thin, onions thinner, simmered in salted water until both went soft and the broth went cloudy. In the hill towns of Kentucky and Tennessee, this soup appeared at the end of every month when money ran short. Grandmothers knew when it was done by smell, and by the way the spoon moved through the pot, not by any clock. Number 23, macaroni and tomatoes. 1 pot. Low heat. Elbow pasta, a can of tomatoes, a pat of butter. Everything cooked together until the pasta absorbed most of the liquid and the tomatoes broke into a loose sauce. For families from Ohio to Mississippi, this was the Tuesday night meal through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Children ate it without argument. Some of them crave it still. Number 22, salmon loaf. A 40-cent can of salmon became dinner for 6. Crushed crackers, an egg, diced onion, mustard if it was in the cabinet. Mixed together, packed into a loaf pan, baked until the outside firmed up and the kitchen smelled like something serious. New England grandmothers served it with white sauce on top. Midwest grandmothers served it plain. Nobody left the table hungry either way. Number 21, slumgullion. The name tells you what it was. Not a recipe, but a philosophy. Ground beef, canned tomatoes, potatoes, cabbage, whatever else was available, simmered together until the flavors stopped being separate and became one thing. Depression-era families across the country made versions under a dozen different names. Slumgullion was the honest one. It never pretended to be more than it was. Number 20, stuffed cabbage. In the Polish neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and the Hungarian communities of Cleveland, grandmothers made this on Sundays. Cabbage leaves wrapped around ground pork and rice, nestled into a pot with tomatoes, simmered for 2 or 3 hours. The recipe crossed the Atlantic and gained American ingredients decade by decade. But the folding, the tucking, the low, slow heat, that part never changed. That lived in the hands. Number 19, bean and bacon soup. Dried navy beans soaked overnight, then cooked slow with salt pork until the broth thickened and the beans went soft all the way through. In the rural South, this was Sunday dinner and Monday lunch and sometimes Tuesday breakfast. The pork flavored the entire pot for the cost of a scrap. Water was added each morning. The pot kept going until there was nothing left to keep going. Number 18, fried mush. Cornmeal cooked into thick porridge the night before, set in the icebox, sliced cold in the morning, and laid in a hot skillet until both sides browned and the edges crisped. Appalachian families ate this at breakfast, but in lean weeks it moved to supper drizzled with molasses or topped with a fried egg if there was one to spare. Nothing that cost less gave more back. Number 17, whatever they called it on your block. Every grandmother in the Midwest made some version of this soup. Broth built from bones and scraps, vegetables that were starting to turn, a handful of barley or rice or whatever starch was left. In some towns, it was called Monday soup. In others, icebox soup or leftover pot or just that soup. It had a different name on every block in America. The reason it no longer has any name at all is worth sitting with. Number 16, Scandinavian meatball gravy. In the Lutheran church halls of Minnesota and the farmhouse kitchens of Wisconsin, this was Sunday dinner. Ground pork and beef mixed by hand, shaped into small rounds, fried in butter, finished in a gravy made from the pan drippings, served over egg noodles or boiled potatoes. No written recipe existed. It existed in the hands of women from the northern plains who had made it enough times that the proportions no longer needed to be considered. Every dish on this list was passed down the same way. Not written, not recorded, shown once in a kitchen, or absorbed by standing close to someone while she cooked and watching carefully. The knowledge lived in demonstration, not on any page. In the years after World War II, millions of American families moved, from farms to factory towns, from the rural South to northern cities, from houses where grandmother lived a short walk away to apartments where she was a day's drive. They brought what could be carried: furniture, photographs, the name of the church, what had no obvious container, what could not be folded into a moving box, was the cooking. Nobody chose to leave it behind. It just did not make the trip. Number 15, tamale pie. This dish moved from Mexican-American kitchens across the Southwest into Anglo-home cooking through church potlucks and quiet neighborhood borrowing. Spiced ground beef, cumin, canned corn, pressed into a cornmeal-lined baking dish and baked until the top set firm. Cheaper than actual tamales, substantial enough for 5, it crossed cultural lines without anyone stopping to name the crossing. Number 14, Hoover stew. Named after Herbert Hoover during the Depression, and not as a compliment. Sliced hot dogs, canned tomatoes, elbow macaroni, sometimes corn, cooked together in one pot until the pasta softened and everything smelled of tomato. Cheap enough to make when almost nothing else was available. Families ate it because it was there and were grateful when it was. Number 13, creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin-sliced dried beef warmed in a white sauce of flour, butter, and milk, spooned hot over toast. Ready in 15 minutes. The ingredients kept on the shelf for weeks. Military families brought a version home from overseas, and it settled into working-class households from Pennsylvania to the Pacific Northwest. Not glamorous, it never tried to be. Number 12, sardine toast. For Catholic families across New England, the Great Lakes, and the industrial East, every Friday was meatless by religious obligation. Sardines made that requirement workable. A can on sliced bread, a squeeze of lemon, sometimes mustard, almost free. Children complained every week. Adults ate without comment. The meal acknowledged a constraint and found a way through it. Every Friday, for years without end. Number 11, lima bean casserole. Dried limas soaked overnight and cooked slow with onion and a ham hock until the beans thickened the broth and the pork flavored everything in the pot. Grandmothers in Georgia and the Carolinas made this through the middle of the week. By the time it was finished, the kitchen smelled like something that had been tended carefully. Because it had. Number 10, Saturday night hash. Leftover potatoes from the week. Whatever meat was still in the icebox. Onions cooked down in a cast iron skillet until the bottom layer crisped and the top stayed soft. Every working-class household in America made some version of this through the 1940s and 1950s. No two were the same because no two iceboxes held the same things. The hash followed the week, not the recipe. Number 9, pickled beet eggs. In the farming towns of Pennsylvania Dutch country, the Lancaster Valley, York County, these sat in large glass jars on the kitchen counter. Hard-boiled eggs submerged in beet juice, cider vinegar, sugar, and pickling spice, left to steep for at least a full day. Sliced open, they showed a ring of deep color narrowing toward the yellow yolk. Nobody needed to be told they were ready. The color told you. Number 8, city chicken. In the Polish neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and the Czech streets of Cleveland, real chicken was too expensive for regular meals. So grandmothers skewered cubed pork and veal on wooden sticks, breaded the pieces, and baked them until the coating crisped and the meat went tender inside. They called it city chicken, because in the city you could not afford the real thing, so you made something that looked like it from something you could. Then industrial farming changed the math entirely. By the early 1970s, chicken had become the cheap everyday meat and pork the more expensive one. The dish lost the only reason it had ever existed, and it was gone within a generation. Number 7. Apple Brown Betty. Stale bread layered with sliced apples and brown sugar, dotted with butter, baked until the top browned and the apples softened underneath. Grandmothers in Appalachia and New England both made versions of this without knowing the other existed. It used bread that would have been discarded and apples from whatever tree stood in the yard. It came out of the oven looking like something that had required effort. That was exactly the point. Number 6, shipwreck casserole. Raw potatoes on the bottom of a covered baking dish. Then onions, uncooked rice, ground beef, kidney beans. A can of tomato soup poured over all of it. Everything went in raw and baked together for over an hour, the layers cooking at different rates and absorbing each other as they went. Nothing about the method made obvious sense, until you tasted it. Then it made complete sense. These dishes did not disappear because families stopped being hungry or because the flavors stopped being good. They disappeared around the same time that cooking itself became something it had never quite been before. Starting in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, food magazines and then television introduced a new standard into American kitchens, that a proper dinner should look a certain way. That following a printed recipe exactly was the mark of a careful cook, and cooking from memory and instinct was the mark of someone who did not quite know what they were doing. Grandmothers who had fed families through the Depression and 2 wars without writing a single thing down found themselves in a world that had no category for what they knew. Nobody said it was wrong. They just stopped being asked to teach it. And after a generation of that, nobody thought to ask anymore. The dishes did not deteriorate. They simply stopped being transmitted. 5. Crackling cornbread. In farmhouse kitchens across the Deep South, the crisp bits of fat left after rendering lard went into the cornbread batter instead of the trash. Baked in a cast-iron skillet, it came out dense and savory, smelling of wood smoke and rendered pork. Nothing required measuring. The skillet told you how much batter. The batter made enough times told your hands when it was right. 4. Molasses bread pudding. Stale bread soaked in eggs, milk, and a heavy pour of molasses, then baked until dark and firm. It started as a method for using what would otherwise have gone out, and came out of the oven tasting as though it had been planned from the beginning. Waste became dessert. That was the whole technique, and it worked every time. 3. Warm milk poured into a bowl. Bread torn into pieces by hand and laid in it to soften. When the icebox had run out and the next paycheck was still days away, this was what families made before they went without. Not dinner, exactly. Just the line between going hungry and not going hungry. Nobody gave it a name because naming it carried a cost most families were not prepared to pay. And that is precisely why nobody discusses it now. 2. Pinto beans and cornbread. Dried pintos cooked all day with a ham bone, cornbread baked in the skillet alongside. Across the rural South and into Appalachia, this was not a side dish. It was the meal. Cheap, slow enough. Families who ate it 3 times a week did not call it poor food. They called it dinner, and they meant it without reservation. 1. The pot that never emptied. On the back burner of farmhouses from Kentucky to Iowa, there was a pot that was never quite empty. Bones gave the broth. Vegetables followed as they came from the garden. Week's end leftovers went in last. Water was added each morning. The flavor deepened over days. Nothing went to waste because the pot would not allow it. This is not a recipe. It is a way of living inside a kitchen that most of us have stopped practicing without noticing that we stopped. Measuring is a tool for people who have not made something enough times to know it yet. A scaffold, not the building. Your grandmother did not measure because she had made the same dishes so many times, under so many different conditions, that the knowledge had become physical. It lived in her hands. The amount of salt was not a teaspoon, it was a feeling. The cooking time was not 45 minutes. It was when it smelled right. The relevant question is not why she never wrote it down. The question is whether anyone was standing close enough, paying close enough attention, to learn it before she was gone. Call your mother. Call your grandmother. Ask them one dish. Watch them make it if you can. Write down what you see. These meals are not all gone yet, but the window is smaller than it has ever been.